"I don't like anything about you, Mother." Those words struck me unexpectedly, like a sharp slap across the face, delivered by my eldest son's wife. It was as if time stood still in that moment, catching me off guard. I had always been a part of my family, a nurturing presence, and hearing such a sentiment from Jessica was deeply painful. It brought back memories of the day I had to leave my parents' home, a moment etched into my memory. The anger that boiled within me at the thought of being kicked out of my own home again was overwhelming. Fine, I thought. If that's how it's going to be, then I'll leave. Determined, I began packing my things, feeling a mix of hurt and indignation. That moment was the last straw for me. I swore to myself I would never forgive Jessica for her words and her demeanor. It was time to put my long-form plan into action. My name is Sander Clark, and I'm about to turn 61 this year. Technically, I'm retired, but I'm fortunate enough to still be working. I don't go into the office every day. I only drop by occasionally for meetings, most of which have shifted to remote formats. As a result, I work from home most of the time, but my eldest son seems to believe I've completely stopped working. I became a widow in my 40s, and since then, I have lived with my eldest son and his wife. My parents' home is an old, somewhat run-down house situated on a large piece of land. Though it's not in the best shape, I've always cherished it, making the thought of leaving it incredibly difficult. Financially, I've never struggled. The bulk of the insurance money from my late husband remains untouched, ensuring that I won't have to worry about my future. Yet, despite this apparent ease, I have my share of concerns, one of the most significant being Jessica. From the very beginning, I sensed the friction brewing between us. Jessica is strong-willed and unyielding, and we often clash. Our conflicts didn't begin recently. I still remember the day she first approached me to inform me of her engagement to my son. I can vividly recall her appearance, dressed in a tracksuit that reminded me of my own high school days. She insisted she wanted to meet me without any pretensions, but from my perspective, her attire was anything but appropriate. Jessica is argumentative, and she has a talent for it, making our interactions increasingly difficult. I often questioned why my son chose her as his partner. It later became clear that Jessica had pursued him. Despite her outrageous behavior, she possesses a beauty that seemed to charm my sheltered son. Even after they got engaged, her personality remained unchanged. While one could say she's down to earth, I found it hard to overlook her lack of common sense. I wanted to voice my disapproval of their marriage, but ultimately, I told myself it was my son's choice, so I kept my opinions to myself. Now, here we are, after their wedding. My son insisted that we live together, not wanting to leave me alone in the family home. Initially, I thought Jessica wouldn't be keen on this arrangement, but to my surprise, she was in favor of it. Soon after we moved in together, I began to understand her true nature. Despite being a full-time housewife, Jessica never contributed to any household chores. Everything fell to me. This was particularly puzzling since she had quit her job when she married my son. Although I don't go to the office daily, I still work from home, which means my time is stretched thin. While I worked diligently at my computer, Jessica would make snide remarks, insinuating that I was merely playing around. At first, I tried to laugh it off to avoid conflict, but her constant jabs grew increasingly irritating. One day, I finally gathered the courage to ask her for help. "Jessica, you seem to have some spare time. Could you lend a hand with the cleaning?" I ventured, hopeful for a change. She shot me a look filled with disdain, sighed dramatically, and replied, "I don't do housework for your sake, Mother. Why don't you understand? It's sad that you can't appreciate my thoughtfulness." She proceeded to explain her bizarre theory. If she took on the housework, I would become lazy and lose my only source of employment, which would ultimately jeopardize my health. In her twisted logic, she believed that not participating in household chores might actually help prevent dementia for me. In her mind, she was doing me a favor by allowing me to handle all the chores myself. "I agreed to live together, so you wouldn't slack off, Mother," she added with a condescending half-smile. I was left speechless. filled with regret over my decision to live with them. If I had chosen to live separately, I could have avoided such disheartening experiences. Instead, every day felt like torture as I completed household tasks while Jessica lounged nearby, seemingly oblivious to my frustration. Eventually, I reached my breaking point and decided it was time to talk to my eldest son. I didn't intend to complain about Jessica, though. Instead, I wanted to express my desire to move into an apartment where I could live independently. The house we occupied was old, with numerous stairs and uneven floors that had caused me significant back pain the previous year. I explained to my son that it simply wasn't practical for me to continue living there. After our conversation, I made the decision to move into an apartment. Although it felt like Jessica had driven me out, I didn't regret my choice. The new place was a rental, and I made sure it was spacious enough for my grandchildren to stay in the future. I even customized the interior to reflect my tastes. It felt like having my own little castle. However, my happiness was short-lived. Jessica began coming over every day, often lingering until late into the night. "This new apartment is really nice, isn't it? But don't you think it's a bit too big for you, Mother?" she remarked as she sprawled on my couch, an air of entitlement surrounding her. "Come on, Mother. Come back to the old house and take care of the chores. It's for your health and longevity." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Jessica was genuinely suggesting that I return to the old house to resume the never-ending housework. Her self-centeredness was astonishing. "I've already moved out, Jessica. You need to step up as the wife now. I handle all the chores here and my health is perfectly fine. I have my annual checkups," I responded firmly. But Jessica merely turned her head away, pretending to ignore my words. This behavior was typical of her. She always acted as if she hadn't heard anything that didn't align with her desires. Despite my protests, she continued to invade my space daily. Just the other day, she even claimed it was too much trouble to return home and ended up staying the night. The distance between my old house and this apartment is only about a mere 15-minute walk separated my new apartment from my old home, but it was my son who suggested I move closer to him. His concern for my well-being tugged at my heartstrings, making it bittersweet to leave the place where I had spent so many years. I had cherished memories there, and the thought of leaving felt heavy. Still, I agreed to a suggestion, hoping it would ease his worries. One afternoon, after returning from a rare business trip, I found myself caught off guard by an unexpected intrusion. As I entered the apartment, I was shocked to discover Jessica sprawled out on the floor in front of the television, seemingly indifferent to my presence. Her casual greeting, "Welcome back," came without any acknowledgement of my return. She didn't even bother to rise from her spot, making it clear she felt entirely at home. "Jessica," I began, struggling to mask the discomfort that washed over me. "That spare key was meant for emergencies, not for you to waltz in when I'm not here." I felt a surge of assertiveness as I spoke, a firmness I had never displayed towards her before. Her startled expression showed that she wasn't used to being confronted like this. "Honestly, you're such a stingy mother-in-law." "I can't stand you," she shot back, her voice dripping with venom. "I can't stand anything about you, especially this apartment. We're family, so you should just leave." With that, she attempted to shove me toward the front door, her resentment palpable and her anger boiling over. It was evident that Jessica harbored deep-seated animosity toward me, fueled by jealousy because I had a comfortable apartment while she and my son, James, were still living in their old house. Her irritation was compounded by the fact that James was responsible for paying the rent for my apartment, which she viewed as entirely unjust. "This is what living beyond your means looks like," she snapped, her voice full of contempt. Her misunderstanding soon became apparent to me. Jessica believed that my son was the one covering the rent. This misconception explained her persistent invasions of my space. She thought my apartment was a privilege that should belong to her family. "Fine, I'll leave," I said, locking eyes with her in defiance. I felt a surge of determination as I made the decision to move out within 3 days. Jessica didn't seem to take me seriously, insisting that I call a moving company in her presence. Reluctantly, I pulled out my phone and arranged for the movers to come in 2 days. Satisfied with this arrangement, she left, but I began to formulate my own plans for the future. As promised, I moved out of my apartment. My new home was a senior-friendly apartment that I intended to test for 2 weeks before fully committing to the change. I handed over the keys and lease documents to Jessica and asked the real estate agent to change the contract into her name, leveraging my good relationship with the landlord to facilitate this transition. When they agreed, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Meanwhile, my eldest son was furious with Jessica for forcing me out of my home. He had voiced his frustrations to me, even contemplating divorce as a solution to the issues she had created in their marriage. Despite his anger, Jessica appeared unfazed, even moving into my old apartment with a bold declaration that she wanted to live separately. Her audacity left me incredulous, but deep down, I knew the truth about the situation would soon come to light. 5 days later, while I was working from home, my phone began to ring incessantly. I glanced at the screen to see Jessica's name flashing repeatedly. Anticipating her call, I had set up a recorder to capture the conversation and hit the record button before answering. "Mother, what's going on with the rent for this apartment? Why am I the one paying it? This isn't fair." Jessica's voice was filled with frustration and panic, revealing her desperation. "Oh, but Jessica," I replied, my tone calm and steady. "Aren't you the leaseholder now? It's only right that you pay the rent. Is there a problem?" My composed demeanor seemed to only agitate her further. "Didn't James used to pay the rent? We're not even divorced yet, so shouldn't he still be responsible for the payments?" she pressed, her confusion evident. When Jessica confronted my son about the rent, he clarified the reality. I had been the one paying for the apartment all along. After retiring, I had continued to work as a consultant and industry advisor, earning a comfortable income, far more than James did. Unbeknownst to Jessica, I had been secretly helping my son financially because he was struggling to keep up with his obligations, largely due to Jessica's extravagant spending habits. "You misunderstood, Jessica," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I've been the one paying the rent for this apartment. James hasn't paid a cent." The shock in her silence was palpable, a moment of realization crashing over her like a wave. Before she could formulate a response, she abruptly hung up the phone. I felt a mixture of triumph and relief as I immediately called my son to let him listen to the recorded conversation. "I've been putting up with this for a while, too," I told him, the weight of my own frustration evident in my voice. "But I'm at my limit. You feel the same way, right?" I knew he was exhausted from dealing with the debts that Jessica had accumulated during their marriage. As his mother, I couldn't help but step in, even if others thought I was being too lenient. In a quiet voice, my son confessed, "I'm going to divorce her. I'm tired of all this." "Then follow my plan," I instructed, laying out the steps he needed to take. I advised him to take a few days of paid leave from work to start moving out his important belongings without Jessica noticing. We agreed that he would have to be discreet about it, gradually moving his things out so that she wouldn't see any moving trucks or become suspicious of his intentions. As the days unfolded, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that I was not just reclaiming my own life, but also helping my son break free from the chaos that Jessica had brought into our lives. Together, we would navigate this challenge, step by step. That night, I took Jessica to a location she didn't recognize, a house I had discovered for my son James as a new living arrangement. The entire process had gone smoothly, and I felt a sense of relief that everything was falling into place. However, just 3 days later, the calm was shattered when Jessica called me again, her voice filled with a frantic energy that sent alarm bells ringing in my mind. "What's got you so worked up now?" I asked, attempting to keep my tone even and calm, just as I had in our previous conversations. "Mother, our house is up for sale," Jessica exclaimed, panic evident in every word. My parents just called and said that my belongings have arrived at their house. What does this mean? In following my instructions, my son had moved out and sent Jessica's belongings to her parents' home. The house she had been living in was now entirely emptied and officially listed for sale. The landlord had informed me that if she couldn't pay the rent, she would have to leave. I tried to talk to James, she continued, her voice trembling with anxiety. But when I got home, the gate was padlocked, and there's even a for sale sign in front. I can't get in. I could hear the hysteria in Jessica's voice, and I could only imagine the shock she felt when she realized her home was no longer accessible to her. I've already signed a contract with the realtor, I said, my voice steady. You can't go back to that house anymore, and there are a few things I want to clarify. First, I'm no longer your mother-in-law. Yesterday, James filed for divorce. You signed the papers, didn't you? So now you and I are just strangers. It was a truth that hung heavily in the air. My son had finally taken the definitive step to file for divorce, a choice Jessica had threatened but never followed through with. She had often wielded the threat of divorce like a weapon to get her way, but now James had come to the painful realization that it was time for him to move on. He had submitted the papers, and now the divorce was official. No turning back. Jessica, you always told James you could get a divorce anytime. Aren't you happy now that things have gone your way? I continued, sensing the silence on the other end of the line. It felt as though time stood still as she processed my words. I could almost feel her holding her breath, grappling with the reality of how drastically things had changed. Jessica wanted to argue, to fight back, but the words seemed to escape her. Her frustration was palpable. Besides, after the divorce, how do you plan to live in that apartment without a job? Moving costs money too. It's not as simple as you think. I pressed on. How did you even manage to pay the rent in the first place? At that, Jessica's composure shattered completely. She erupted into a torrent of anger, her voice rising as she yelled and cursed at me. In her fury, she admitted that she had married my son primarily for the inheritance my late husband had left behind. The irony was that, since I managed that inheritance, she had no access to any of it. Her voice was filled with rage as she screamed that everything in her life was going wrong, despite the fact that she had entered into the marriage in hopes of alleviating her financial struggles. I couldn't help but think about how my son needed to hear this confession. After all, I planned to use the recording of this conversation as evidence in the divorce settlement. Jessica continued her rant for what felt like an eternity, about 15 minutes, while I remained calm and composed, waiting for her to exhaust herself. Eventually, her anger crumbled into despair. I've been disowned by my family. I have nowhere to go. Please help me, she cried, her voice cracking. In that moment, she revealed how her parents had cut her off due to her reckless spending and borrowing habits. While a flicker of sympathy stirred within me, I knew that her situation was a direct consequence of her choices. Apologizing now won't change anything. We're no longer family, and there's nothing more to say. Good luck with your life, I stated firmly before ending the call. As I hung up, a wave of relief washed over me, releasing the tension I had been holding. Later, my son informed me of a disturbing incident at his workplace. Jessica had caused such a scene that the police were called in to manage the situation. While all of this was happening, her landlord had changed the locks on her apartment because of her unpaid rent, effectively leaving her locked out. Jessica likely attempted to contact both me and my son in her desperation, but we had changed our phone numbers, leaving her without any way to reach us. Moreover, we hadn't disclosed our new address, ensuring she couldn't find us. After the chaos at my son's job, Jessica was served with a restraining order. With nowhere else to turn, she returned to her family home, but they refused to let her inside. The luggage I had sent to her parents' house was left outside in the rain, and she wasn't permitted to step foot in the house. To exacerbate her situation, her parents received a bill for her unpaid rent, likely fueling their anger even further. I later heard that Jessica was now living in an apartment provided by an organization that assists homeless individuals. The next time I spotted her on the street, I was taken aback. She looked completely different. Her hair had turned a stark white, her skin appeared dry and cracked, and the stress was etched across her features. I barely recognized her, and it was shocking to see how much her life had deteriorated. As for me, I had embarked on a new chapter in my life. Using my late husband's inheritance, I purchased a new house, a duplex, so that my son could remarry whenever he felt ready. Although he still joined me for dinner from time to time, he was largely taking care of his own affairs. I realized that this distance was just right for both of us. The funds from selling my parents' house were set aside for my son's future, and potentially for his future wife and children. I began contemplating the English garden I had always dreamed of establishing at my new home. On my days off, I found joy and solace working in the garden, nurturing the plants and watching them thrive. This new routine became a source of peace and hope for the future, allowing me to heal and rebuild my life after the turmoil.